Mhm. Okay, let's continue with the second part of this morning. I'd like to invite Dr. Aunshul Rege from Temple University. Please give her a warm round of applause.
Super excited to be here. Just be patient with me because it's about 6 a.m. in Philadelphia, so I'm waking up. So what I want to talk about a little bit today is not what I usually do, which is research. Today I want to talk about a pet project of mine that my grad student and I have been working on for, I want to say two and a half years now. And this is something that emerged because we were struggling with what researchers always struggle with, which is getting data. So we decided to develop a critical infrastructure ransomware data set that we like to think of as community driven, because it's something that the community can have conversations with us about, and we can bring as much of their voice into our data set as possible. So a little bit about me and Rachel Wyman, who's my graduate student. So we focus on the human and socio-behavioral aspects of cyber attacks and cybersecurity, primarily in the space of critical infrastructure, ransomware, privacy surveillance, mis and disinformation, social engineering, and more recently, the area of cybersecurity education. Our work has predominantly been supported by grants from the National Science Foundation and also from the U.S. Department of Energy and Idaho National Labs, which is a government lab. More recently, and it's not on the slides, but for those of you who are familiar with DEF CON, the world's largest hacking conference, they have a social engineering community there, and I work as their research lead. So as you can see, we're trying to really bring the human voice into a lot of the discussions and research and education aspects of cyber attacks and cybersecurity. So I direct a lab called the CARE Lab, which is cybersecurity and application research and education. So that's a little bit about us. Rachel, who is not here because it's 6 a.m. there and I don't want to be cruel, sends her hello. What's on the agenda today? I want to talk a little bit about the inspiration behind this. Why did we even bother creating this data set? For those of you who are active in the data science space, which I'm not, I am a social scientist. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we use the OSCMN framework to sort of adapt it to our needs and the limitations of that as we went about creating our data set. I want to talk then about how the two of us thought about, well, how can we make this data set better? And then also open it up to the community to see what kind of feedback we've gotten over the past two and a half years. I'm going to share some of our usage statistics. How has it been useful to various members of the community? And then talk about where are we headed. So as I mentioned, it's all about the data that no one wants to share. Okay, so we know that there's ransomware related incidents when it comes to critical infrastructure. And I'm not going to get into the conversation of IT versus OT. If you want to have a chat with me about that, we can do that offline. But typically, the large corps, as I like to call them, who house the data, don't want to share it, right? Either because it's sensitive or proprietary or legal, or I'd have to sign off on MOUs or memorandums of understandings or non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, which means I can't ever talk about anything and I can't write about it. And also as a researcher, as an academic, it's not something that I can afford. So we started our own data set in September of 2019, which focused on, like I said, ransomware attacks against critical infrastructures. We are basing our critical infrastructure taxonomy on the U.S. Department of Homeland Security taxonomy, which identifies 16 critical infrastructures. So when we started, we had 167 incidents. And we decided to look for a framework that would guide us in terms of how do we want to collect the data clean it up and sort of look for themes and, commonalities between different things, because we are creating this data set from the ground up. How are we going to decide what key themes we identify that translate into variables that are going to be part of this data set? Okay, so we borrowed the OSCMN framework from the hard sciences. And I'm going to talk about the first three because those are the ones that are most relevant to the data set. So in terms of the O, the obtain, right? It's literally as simple as setting up Google Alerts. That's our starting point, but then based on what we uncover, we go about looking for white papers and reports and all those types of things. So not just recent cases, but we also go back in time to see if we've missed anything. And we maintain everything in a simple Excel data set. It's not fancy, right? So if anyone requests our data set, which is available for free, that's what you're getting. You're getting an Excel file. The S, the scrub of the data. So, how do we know that we've got good data? We, first of all, look at questionable cases. If it's incomplete information or things like, oh, we're getting contradictory information, we sort of sit down and have chats with each other about how do we want to go, right? Proceed with that. The Explorer. So this is a very qualitative approach to how we went about doing this. We went through the information to the point of attaining thematic saturation. So what do I mean by that? When we found that there were no new variables, right, or themes that would emerge, we essentially stopped creating categories or variables. So these were the ones that we started off with. I think we've tapered off, but these are some of the themes that kept showing up in our articles. And so we decided to use these as variables in our data set. But we're finding that there's some of these that are not always available. So we're questioning whether we want to retain that in our data set or not. So this is something that's continuously changing based on how we're monitoring it. Okay, so one of those, like I said, is the duration of the attack. Not a lot is always available about this information. So, do we discontinue it moving forward? So obviously some of the limitations, it's not open source. So obviously not all incidents are going to be available to us. For the folks who request our data set outside the United States, they're always questioning us on, well, how'd you come up with your taxonomy, right? So we based ours based on CISA, Homeland Security, which identifies 16 critical infrastructure categories. So that's what we use. Obviously, it's going to lack depth because not all variables are going to get equal weight and consideration depending on what's available in open source, right? And then, of course, the very methodology of it could we have gone a different way, okay? Such as doing interviews with subject matter experts and then bringing that in and populating and improving on our data set. So as we were, as we started this off, like I said, we started off in September 2019, and that was our first version. We decided to add the location of where this was happening. This was not something that we had covered. But one of the reasons why we decided to include that, because we're like, well, it would be cool if folks could then use our data set to spatially map the incidents, because, and as you'll see later, majority of the requests that we got from students were, oh, I want to do a class project on this, and it'd be really nice if you could have a variable dedicated to this. And we said, okay, we can do that. And it was available enough times in the open source literature that it got its own variable. Rank by amount and duration. So we already had a column or variable, if you will, for the actual ransom amount, but we wanted to create categories for ranges. So it would help with statistical analysis. So this is something else that we got both from our own reflections, but also from requests from the community. So that groups, you could start looking at ranges and look at groups in terms of where the majority of attacks lie. Okay, so that was something that was an easy update to add into our data set. The code book, we knew how we were coding it, but the public did not. So we obviously got people going, well, what's your taxonomy? How are you defining the variables? And it's a good thing that we did that from the get-go, because we could easily roll that out into the next iteration to improve transparency and clarity. Fast forward a little bit, right? Version 10.1. So we had, if you notice here, the variable codebook came out in modification 3, or sorry, whoops, I'm going backward, in version 7. We added the critical infrastructure codebook in 10.1 to, again, for improving transparency and clarity, but also to help our international users, right, who are not from the United States. So yeah, one of the other mods that we did in that same rollout was adding a secondary critical infrastructure sector. This is to reflect the interdependencies between critical infrastructure. So a lot of time an attack would target one, but it also often hit another one. So a particular one would be IT and healthcare, or government and emergency services. So if we saw enough of those types of connections, we said, all right, maybe it deserves a secondary CI sector that was impacted. So that's something else that we added. We also decided with each rollout to say what was new, or what was different, or what was corrected, again, to improve transparency. So whether this actually came out from discussions with other folks who maintain their own data sets, they said, hey, you might want to consider having a dedicated tab in your Excel file that speaks to this. So we did that. This was another feedback we got from the community. And they actually said, can you in any way, shape, or form map this to the MITRE ATT&CK framework? And so we started doing that. So for the ransomware strains, if it existed, we connected it to the software ID. We cross-checked it also against MITRE's ICS attack framework. So we've been doing that. And we actually work actively with the folks at MITRE ATT&CK. Interestingly, they've been some of the people who've also used our data set. So, but that was a big request we got from the community, so we were happy to accommodate that. There were often times when people said, well, you're missing this incident, you might want to add it. Or, no, that ransom amount isn't really right. Here's the actual amount. So you might want to fix your data set. So we were able to do a lot of that. So we added an actual form to our website through which you could report that to us. We would cross-check it again. Of course, if all looked good, we would then update our data set accordingly. So everything up until now, stuff that I talked about, are the things that we could do, right, based on the feedback that we got. But there's still a lot that we cannot do. And these are the top requests that we keep getting from the community that we cannot accommodate because we are limited by open source data. But folks want to know, what are the points of the entries, and, yes, phishing, or was it introduced through a flash drive, or what was it, right? So can we get more of that? Who's behind it? So obviously origin country or the specific group, are there any patterns or signatures that you could share? Impacts and interruptions. So this is getting into the harms caused. This is where obviously we're struggling because we just, again, if it's not an open source, we can provide that. And even if it's here or there, it has to occur enough times or regularly for us to say, okay, you get your own dedicated variable in the data set. But there's a lot of interest. So for those of you who are working in this space, these are some of the areas that the community has identified. So what we did is, starting version 10.4, we had a dedicated tab in the file. So that every time you request a data set and we sent it out, you could actually see the wish list. And if you were working in that space, or if you knew someone who's working in that space, maybe you could pick it up and sort of, do research along those lines. So statistics, who's using our data set? So as I mentioned, when we started creating this, we did this to support other educators, students, and researchers, because we were struggling. And educators have used this a lot for designing course projects for their classes, but also for their own academic research, right? So analyzing threats or developing policies, effects on company performance, developing attack models, historical analysis, right, which is really cool. But that makes about 11% of those who are requesting our data set, which is interesting because that's the community we had hoped to accommodate or serve. Students are at 16%. So undergraduate students are using these for their the data set for their honors thesis class projects. Graduate students using it for their own dissertations, either during literature reviews or, again, looking at frequencies and global trends. But that's where we had stopped, right? Because that, again, those were the communities we wanted to serve. Interestingly, industry started coming to us, which we had not anticipated. I'm still a little bitter. Anyone from industry here, by the way? Is anyone here from industry? Oh, sorry. I find it extremely, what's the word I'm looking for? Unfair, right? That we have to pay to get data sets from industry, but industry can come to us and request our data sets. And so, some folks have said, well, why don't you start charging industry for this? But 29%, right? And these are folks who are trying to use this for either research and training of internal members, trying to compare it against their own internal data sets that they don't share, incident response planning, threat assessment and modeling, right, to do their own sort of risk analysis, insurance, micro attack mappings, and the like. So that was, again, a community that we had not had in mind, but we are catering to it. Government, and I'm not talking about just the US government, I'm talking about governments in the EU, UK, Asia, right, Africa. So we've had government entities request this from all over the world. Similar sorts of things that they're doing as industry. So again, training classes, threat intelligence and modeling, program policy and strategy developments along those lines. So, so we've done all right. So something that started in September 2019, to date, right? We've gotten some pretty good coverage that I'm pretty impressed about and proud about. So yeah, okay, so this has been a great sort of way for us to, again, get the word out and engage, have members from the community engage with us. But currently we're on version 12. We have about 1,196 incidents. This helps me because I can take this back to my funding agency and say, hey, look at all the cool things we did with taxpayer dollars. Can you give us more money? We have come up with some really cool collaborations out of this, which is nice. And again, like I said, this is very community driven. So we do like to hear from you and learn. And that's everything that I have. So if there's any questions or comments, I'm happy to take them.